Welcome to today's World Refugee Day seminar, which is hosted by the Maghreb Action on Displacement and Rights Network Plus, or MADAR. My name's Laura Jeffrey and I'm the co-director of MADAR, which is funded by the UKRI's AHRC Global Challenges Research Fund, often known as GCRF. MADAR itself, the Network Plus, aims to improve the humanitarian protection of vulnerable displaced people in contexts of conflict and in the central Maghreb region, so of Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia. And today I'm really pleased to be chairing our Refugee Day webinar on the topic of going home, refugee repatriation in history. Now, just before I introduce our two speakers, I have two items of housekeeping. The first, as you may have noticed already, is that we have interpretation from French to English and English to French. So if you would like to use interpretation during this webinar, you can select an interpretation channel via the interpretation button on your Zoom screen. For me, it's at the bottom of my Zoom screen, but for you, it may be somewhere else. The second thing is that we suggest that you view the webinar in what's called speaker view, so that the meeting will automatically flow with the person who's speaking, so that they appear larger on screen than the others. But during the presentation itself, it will mostly be slides in any case. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers today. Malika Rahal is a specialist in contemporary Algerian history, and she's currently director of the Institut d'Histoire du Temps Présent in Paris. And Benjamin Thomas White teaches Middle East and refugee history at the University of Glasgow, where he is also part of the Glasgow Refugee Asylum and Migration Network, GRAMNet. And both Malika and Ben have published all over the place, but just today I'm just going to mention that they have a co-authored article entitled UNHCR and the Algerian War of Independence, Post-Colonial Sovereignty and the Globalization of the International Refugee Regime 1954 to 1963, which was recently published in the Journal of History. And Ben and Malika have agreed to speak for around 40 minutes to leave time for questions afterwards. And what we're going to do today is record the talk for the MADAR website, where we keep all of our webinars, but we're not going to record the question and answer. So after the presentation, we will switch off the recording. Okay, I think that's me. Over to you, Malika and Ben, for your presentation, and then I'll chair the question and answer session after you're finished.
Thanks very much, Laura. And I'll start, and Malika and I will go back and forth throughout the presentation that's coming. And I just need to reorganize my Zoom screen so that I don't have everyone's images in the way of my notes. In contemporary refugee protection, and in fact for decades now, people have often spoken of the three main durable solutions to refugee crises: repatriation of refugees to the home country, integration in the country of asylum, and resettlement to a third country. Recent research has shown that the notion of durable solutions itself is a fairly recent one, dating from the 1970s, and that different periods have given rise to different notions of what lasting resolutions to a population displacement might look like. But all three of these solutions have existed in some form since the modern system of international refugee protection first took shape after the First World War. We're focusing today on one of them, repatriation. When the League of Nations was set up after the First World War to preserve the fragile peace, the Norwegian polar explorer and humanitarian Fridtjof Nansen, here he is in the slide, was appointed as its first High Commissioner for Refugees. But he was asked to do this job because he'd already successfully overseen the response to another problem: repatriation of hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war at the end of the First World War. And these two problems were related. Several of the states that fought the First World War either, apologies, I'm having some trouble with my notes there. Several of the states that fought the First World War either broke apart under the strain the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, which collapsed in 1917 and 18, or had lost large parts of their territory to new states or to colonial encroachment, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, which itself had vanished entirely by 1923. Soldiers in imperial armies who were prisoners of war at the end of the war had no empire to go home to, and often their homes now belonged to new states that didn't want them back. Working out where they should go and how was a major task, and Nansen did a very good job of it, getting some 600,000 soldiers home at an average cost of £1 each, so good value too. Although home often meant a state that hadn't existed at the start of the war, and sometimes meant a place that they'd never lived in previously. Civilian populations that had been displaced during the war were in a similar situation. The empires that they'd been displaced from no longer existed. The nation states that had replaced them didn't want all of them back. And some of those who were wanted found themselves going home to places they'd never lived in before. Home. But this was a much bigger problem than the problem of prisoners of war. The civilians displaced during the First World War and in the many smaller conflicts that followed it in the years 1918 to 23 numbered in the millions. And this is why Europeans in this period began to speak of the refugee problem. Nansen's office at the League of Nations was tasked with helping states to resolve it, and repatriation was one of the methods he used. And we can already see that repatriation is rarely as simple as going home. Now, from the point of view of historians, there is some historical research on refugee repatriation in practice and also in principle, but there isn't much. And some of the historical work that does exist is written by people who aren't actually historians as their day job, like the political scientist Megan Bradley, who wrote a historical study of repatriations over the 25 years from 1990. This goes for a number of other key texts. More common than historical approaches to the subject is legal or philosophical scholarship on the principle of repatriation, like Molly Garver's work in Practical Ethics, or social science research that follows specific groups of refugees after their repatriation, for example, in the Balkans, Central America, or East Africa, some of which tries to draw general lessons. And quite a bit of this literature is focused on the 1990s, which the UN optimistically declared the decade of repatriation. But as historians, we don't really have a sense of how repatriation has developed over time. For example, from something that was planned for large groups, if not entire refugee populations, to something that is now often carried out at the level of small groups, families, or individual refugees. We have some idea of how repatriation fits into the history of refugee protection since the 1990s, as a post-Cold War world, has become less ambitious about solving refugee crises and more prone to suspending them indefinitely through encampment. But we don't have a sense of how repatriation fits within the larger history of the modern system of refugee protection, especially over the whole century since 1920. And we don't have a template for how historians should study repatriations individually or altogether. What are the key factors we need to think about as we try and understand this never simple process? What are the different scales of analysis we should explore, zooming in as close as individual refugees' choices, and zooming out to encompass international organizations, humanitarian agencies, and national governments operating together within global geostrategic conjunctures? How does repatriation work in practice? I said just then that Nansen organized the repatriation of 600,000 prisoners of war. Of course, it wasn't just Nansen. There are many people working in large bureaucratic organizations to make something like that happen. And perhaps most important, how is repatriation experienced by the people who are repatriated? This talk tries to set out such a template by exploring one case, the repatriation of over 200,000 Algerian refugees from Morocco and Tunisia in the space of a few weeks in 1962, after a ceasefire marked the beginning of the end of the Algerian War of Independence and 132 years of French colonization in Algeria, And I'll hand over to Malika now.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon to all. Masa al khair. So I'll pick up where Ben left off to speak about the situation that we are focusing upon today, which is refugees during the Algerian War of Independence, which was launched in 1954 and ended in 1962. And speak first about who these refugees are. By the end of the war, it's generally considered that there were above 300,000 refugees in both Morocco and Tunisia. They didn't arrive immediately after the beginning of the war, but progressively fled the country. They were fleeing violence, especially in the last part of the war. Often they spontaneously left Algeria and settled without any possessions, sometimes with their cattle. Some of them were nomadic populations, and they tended to settle in the regions of Morocco and Tunisia where local resources were available for them to live. We have, for example, one report from the National Liberation Front, the FLN-affiliated Algerian Red Crescent, that had not yet been recognized by the International Red Cross movement, but nevertheless existed. This report dates back probably from 1958, and it considered that by that time there already were 190,000 refugees in both countries, Tunisia and Morocco, half of which would have been children, 35% of which women, and 15% older people. So very few men, because of course, men, like in the Ukraine today, would have been involved in the war. Obviously, part of the report aims to focus on diseases, economic difficulties, to try and define the economic support that the FLN could bring and the Red Crescent could bring to these populations. We also have an ICRC, an International Committee of the Red Cross report dating back from June 1957 that also gives an idea of the living conditions and the hardship of these refugee populations, but also confirms how the first relief operations that were organized were in fact organized by the National Liberation Front. So the movement that was leading the struggle for independence of Algeria. Things changed beginning in 1960 or end of 1959 and 1960, with much more international involvement in the relief and the support of Algerian refugees. There are a number of texts. The earliest one would have been a resolution, a UN resolution of December 5th, 1958, adopting a resolution to support Algerian refugees in Tunisia and Morocco and recommending a joint relief operation headed by the UNHCR with its ally on the ground, which was the League of Red Cross Societies, the League of National Red Cross Societies. So this is what we speak about when we speak about the joint operation. It's UNHCR and League of the Red Cross that does the work on the ground. What are we talking about here? We are talking about distributing food, and in particular putting into place milk stations for children, handing out blankets. Many of these people would have been living in huts made of grass with very little shelter, and working with Moroccan and Tunisian authorities in order to progressively improve the quality of the constructions. By January of 1960, the greatest donors for this operation, this joint operation, were the United States, France, Yugoslavia, but there are many other actors in this operation, including, and that's often left off sometimes in the sources, very practical help from the Red Crescent of Tunisia and of Morocco. There are also a number of NGOs involved in support of the refugees, NGOs like Save the Children, Reda Barnen, that had been working in Morocco or Tunisia for a long time and began helping the refugees. A second text is a resolution passed concerning the World Year of Refugees that was organized between June 1959 and June 1960, and which discussed the possibility of adding Algeria in an effort to bring in non-European situations to this focus on refugees. International organizations had been accused of focusing mostly on European refugees. And so the International Year of Refugees was the opportunity to show that they also focused on non-European situation. Algeria was one of those that was suggested in order to show that they were broadening, if you'd like, their scope. This led these international organizations, UNHCR and the League of the Red Cross Societies, to ask for donations, for clothing, for material for Algerian refugees to be able to sew their own clothes, teaching materials, because the educational systems in both Morocco and Tunisia were not yet able to cope with the number of refugees, probably not able to cope with their own population, let alone with Algerian refugees. Again, milk stations, mobile clinics that were used to improve the health of the refugees. What's interesting for us is that how long the war ended up lasting, and that last period of war, you could call it the war of President de Gaulle, the time when the war was the most cruel against civilian populations, forced this international joint operation to face an increasing number of refugees over time, leading to a number of problems and to the question of how many refugees there were by the end of the war. In January 1962, the League considered that there were 171,000 refugees in Tunisia and 153,000 refugees in Morocco, so a total of 324,000 refugees. These numbers are very fragile. There are numbers of discussions between actors. For example, in February 1962, suddenly 65,000 of them are considered suddenly Moroccan, proving that there had to be a separation of nationality over this issue of who was a refugee and who was not. And I will hand over to Ben.
Thanks. The Evian Accords of March 1962 brought the long and brutal conflict to a provisional end, or at least mapped out a route by which it would be ended. There was a ceasefire between the Algerian forces and the French military, although violence continued, particularly violence against Algerian Muslim targets by the Organisation Armée Secrète, the OAS, an army, a paramilitary organization made up of French refuseniks and French settler refuseniks in Algeria, which also carried out spectacular terrorist violence against French state targets. So the war, the main war had reached a ceasefire. Violence, though, was a terrible feature of Algeria as the repatriation began to be planned. The Evian Accords decided that repatriation would be the responsibility of a tripartite commission composed of French, Algerian, and UNHCR representatives. The Algerian representatives would be from the provisional executive that had been set up as a transitional government to take place, and that there would be representation on the ground in Algeria and outside Algeria, particularly in Morocco and Tunisia, who would manage the repatriation operation. This was the first time UNHCR had been asked to participate in an operation like this. I'm sorry, I've just skipped one slide ahead too fast. Who were the main actors then? There was UNHCR, but also the League of Red Cross Societies, because on the ground it was the League of Red Cross Societies that was managing the relief operation. The Algerian authorities, their provisional government, GPRA, and particularly the Algerian military forces, the Armée de Libération Nationale, the National Liberation Army, or ALN. And then the French authorities, who often on the ground put up obstacles to the operation, for instance, by demanding vaccinations and medical examinations for the repatriating refugees, on the grounds that this would stop them bringing epidemic diseases into a territory that was still under French control, though in fact the refugees in Morocco and Tunisia tended to be in better health than the Algerian Muslim population within Algeria, especially by this stage. But it wasn't just UNHCR, Algerian authorities and French authorities that were involved. The Moroccan and Tunisian authorities were involved, as Malika said, with their respective national Red Crescent organizations, and then international NGOs like Oxfam, different national branches of Save the Children, or the British Quaker NGO, the Friends Service Council. These had been involved in the relief operation on the ground in Morocco and Tunisia. And as the war came to an end, they were preparing to follow the refugees back into Algeria, where help would certainly still be needed. All this taking place in a complex global context of the height of the Cold War, really. Now, our knowledge of the repatriation operation as historians is uneven, because the archival record is very uneven. And in terms of the bulk of the available sources, and when I say available sources, I mean not just what has survived, but what historians can readily access. It's the international organizations and NGOs that dominate. And of course, by this stage, humanitarian agencies were already highly sophisticated operations concerned to present themselves as efficient bringers of aid in order to, therefore to publicize themselves, in order to raise funds successfully. This means that their publicity operation to some extent dominates the archival record. So the UNHCR and the League had information service representatives managing the image of the operation on the ground in Tunisia and in Morocco. In Tunisia, a Canadian woman named Marguerite Wilson was in contact with press agencies, newspapers, radio and TV stations, and so on. She would organize visits to refugee camps and transit camps, for example, for photographers from Paris Match, Time, or Life magazine. And she was individually shaped some of the visual archival records. She was worried that FLN flags, that's to say Algerian flags, might be too visible in pictures, and took steps to make sure that they weren't shown. Meanwhile, her counterparts on the ground in Morocco, an Egyptian named Yassine Al-Ayouti, would issue information bulletins in Arabic, French, and English, again, to an audience of the international press. So from the available archival sources and the press sources, we know a lot about the involvement of international organizations and NGOs. We know much less about the involvement of Algerian nationalist organizations like the FLN, its armed forces, or related social organizations. And even the involvement of Tunisian or Moroccan state agencies is, as Malika pointed out, quite hard to see. The archives that are available to us as historians most easily, most readily, are those of these international organizations and NGOs, and unsurprisingly, they stress and perhaps overstate the role of international organizations and NGOs. But if, as Malika has done, you interview Algerian refugees who experienced the repatriation, often as children, because this is all 60 years ago, they retain no memory of international relief organizations. What's burned into their memories was the amazing sight of Algerian combatants, not in hiding, but in public, standing alongside French and international representatives, Algerian doctors providing medical treatment, more generally, Algerians in positions of authority that was not repressed by the French, but was acknowledged by the French. So we'll move on now to talk a bit about that.
So the repatriation itself, as Ben has just mentioned, was put into place and organized by a tripartite organization of repatriation, French, Algerian, and NGOs, with the creation of transit camps. One of these transit camps, the location is unknown, is on the picture here. The idea was for refugees to gather in these transit camps and spend a night under tents before leaving back to Algeria. During their stay in the transit camps, their documents would be checked, they would have a medical examination, but then they would follow carefully designed itineraries that had been checked for mines by the ALN, by the Algerian Liberation Army. Why was all of this necessary when many of them, in fact, wanted to go home spontaneously and by their own means? Because, in fact, by that stage in the war, we're not talking here about a fine line that would be the border, but we're talking, in fact, of a vast borderland region. Sometimes it's over 10 kilometers wide, and much of these borderland regions would have been filled with mines by the end of the war. It's generally considered that 12 million mines were set by the French during the war, many of which in the borderlands land regions. So it was necessary to put this operation into place to make sure that none of the refugees spontaneously went back with the risk of dying in these mined regions. The result of all this planning is a map of repatriation, which I think, Ben, if you can change the slide. Oops.
Sorry, I have the problem that my cursor keeps disappearing, so I can't see it. I can't see what I'm clicking on.
Well, listen, no worries. When you find the map, you'll be able to see on the map that there are a number of transit camps in Morocco, for example, with carefully designed itineraries into Algeria that had been carefully checked. Tripartite commissions installed both, or settled or organized both, in Morocco on the one hand and Tunisia on the other, with personnel and medical personnel from the Red Cross national societies, as well as Algerian activists. In every transit camp, for example, the medical team was headed by an ALN, a National Liberation Army doctor. The administrative personnel for these operations would have been German, Canadian, British, Finnish, Italian, Swiss, etc. Modalities differed from camp to camp and place to place. In Oujda, for example, on the Moroccan side, this is the second from the north transit camp, about 1,000 refugees would be able to leave the country every day by train into Algeria. In Souani, refugees would travel by Moroccan trucks and would have been fed with Campbell's soup and warm meals. In Bergent, for example, further south, there was a little bit of a problem there because the nomadic populations that were the refugees took longer than expected to rally the transit camps. In Tunisia, on the other side, 9 departure camps had been equipped so that 6,000 refugees could leave the country every day under Tunisian and Algerian authorities with multinational medical teams. The logistics of all of this involved 100 trucks, drivers, buses that came from the League of Red Cross Societies, the Tunisian authorities, the ALN, and inside of Algeria from the French authorities. Again, like in Morocco, Campbell's soup was involved. And in one comment, Madame Wilson, that Ben mentioned earlier, complains that the Tunisian don't really like Campbell's soup, but once harissa has been added to the soup, then it becomes okay. There's a whole ceremony to launch this operation that took place in the village of Haidra on May 30th, 1962, with a convoy of 100 families in presence of Tunisian authorities, representatives of UNHCR and the ICRC, with journalists describing how women are singing and children are joyous, but also how there is some tension at the moment of crossing the border into Algeria. Border was held by the French authorities, by the French army, and the sight of the French army brought back bad memories to many of these refugees, and it was not simple either on the French side to open up the barriers and leave these refugees, let these refugees enter. By the end of this operation of repatriation, 181,000 refugees would have been transported back into Algeria. So that's much less than the number that I mentioned earlier of over 300,000. It is possible that some of these refugees decided to stay in Morocco and Tunisia. It is also possible that despite the carefully organized repatriation operation, some of them came back by their own means without the possibility for the international organizations to count them. This is one of the bits of information that we get from somebody called Claudine Chollet, who was one of the provisional Algerian government employees in charge of this operation for the provisional government, who tells various stories of informal passing of the border, some of which extremely dangerous, that may or may not have been counted in this total number of refugees, and that may explain why we seem to lose some refugees in the process. And then I'd like us to look at, you can see on the pictures how there's this co-presence on the images of families, children, often dressed in their best clothing and still threatening French military presence side by side, and people who were at war a few days before who suddenly are meant to trust each other in this crossing of the border. One last image that I would like to show of this repatriation operation is one, here's another series of scenes from this repatriation operation and the way the families crossed the borders, is this image taken from a newsreel shot in Oujda in the transit camp where people were taking the train, if you remember, to travel back to Algeria. And a woman, we don't know if this is an Algerian woman or maybe this is a Moroccan woman, saying goodbye to the people who left before her or just left the country. And at first, when I saw the film, I thought she was giving them a V for victory. And then looking at it a little bit more closely, I realized she was in fact showing 3 fingers. It took me a little while to ask questions to Algerians who had lived in Morocco at the end of the war. And for them, this sign, this 3-fingered sign, is the sign of solidarity between Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And the sign that finally the third of the 3 Maghribi countries was joining the 2 others in independence. So a sign that came from several years back and the return of the Moroccan Sultan to Morocco after his exile, and the sign of how women, even if they don't tell in words many political stories, often have incorporated in very small gestures their own form of political involvement. And I'm handing over to Ben. Or not, where I'm continuing.
No, this is your section too, Marika.
It's my section too. So what happens after the return is an interesting question. And a lot of the tension over the repatriation operation stems from the uncertainty of what will happen to the refugees once they have reached Algeria. One of the problems here is that refugees travel back to Algeria to a landscape of displacement that is much broader than their own situation as refugees. For one thing, with massive destructions within the country, destructions of villages, in the creation of forbidden zones by the French army in the last section of the war, it is hardly possible for many of these refugees to resettle in their villages of origin. Also, a lot of these refugees were originally from the borderland regions. So even in cases when it was possible for them to reach their village, it was not always possible for them to farm the land, for example. This is a problem that had been foreseen by Algerian authorities. For example, the FLN ambassador to the United States, somebody called Abdelkader Chanderli, was one who explained very early on to American authorities these problems of resettling refugees who would no longer be able to live in their own villages. In the documents that we have found in the international organization archives, for example, it is very clear that in some cases, refugees resettled in their destroyed villages, and they planted the tents that had been given to them in Tunisia and or Morocco in the ruins of their village. In one case, for example, in the Tlemcen region in the west of Algeria, one group of inhabitants, the Beni Boussaid, resettled in their village, but they were completely unable to farm the land around the village, but even to reach the wells in order to fetch water. So they were entirely dependent on various forms of relief and aid for their daily life and incapable of reorganizing their economic activities due to the mine lands around their village. This question of mines was extremely urgent in 1962 because mines, in fact, continued to kill after the end of the war. As I mentioned, there were 12 million mines, anti-personnel mines set by the French army, and many journalists at the end of 1963 were telling stories of how the border towns, for example, were seeing increasing numbers of people wounded with their legs torn off by exploding mines, and that this was becoming a huge problem. The demining operations in Algeria ended in 2017 with the help of the maps handed over by the French finally in 2007. So you can imagine how this problem had remained a problem well after the war. The result of that is that really for refugee populations, it was sometimes extremely difficult to find a place within the country. And in some cases, they in fact could not go back to their villages or places of origin, but were had to replace populations that were themselves set in motion. What do I mean by this? The fact that within Algeria, by the end of the war, 1/4 of the Algerian population had been deported and moved into what is called by the French regroupment camps, or by the French army, which is really a part of concentration camps in a colonial setting. Many of the people who had been put in regroupment camps with the ceasefire also aimed to move back to their villages of origin, but in some cases, when they left the camp, they were immediately replaced by refugee populations for whom these camps were better than nothing, if you'd like. So we have constant movement and refugees who do not find their place or do not find their home directly by the end of the war. And what Ben is showing is a series of images of regroupment camps. You can see that they come in various shapes or forms, some of them made of grass that tended to disappear in 1962 very rapidly. Others that resembled more modern types of villages or more solid constructions that are still occupied by former refugees until the present in some cases. So you can see that this pattern of going home blends into the general question for the entire Algerian population at the end of the war and the end of the colonial period. How do you return home when everybody is being displaced or trying to find their place back in the country at the end of war? And this time, I think I am actually passing over to Ben for real.
Thanks, Malika. So as Malika said, all of this shows that the repatriation of Algerian refugees wasn't a simple instance of going home. When they went back to Algeria, they often couldn't return to their actual homes. Houses had been destroyed, farmland had been mined, and their problems were immediately folded into the larger problems of displacement and humanitarian crisis affecting Algerians who hadn't left the country. The final couple of images here show milk distribution of the sort that had been carried out as part of the joint relief operation in Morocco and Tunisia, now taking place in Algeria as humanitarian organizations fed particularly the old and the young, and we'll see in the next slide, among a population, large parts of which had been forcibly displaced and all of whom had been brutalized by the conflict. This is a more general phenomenon. If the millions of Syrians currently living abroad as refugees ever return to the country, for example, and regime planning doesn't intend for many of them to return, but if they ever do, much of the country's housing stock has been destroyed in over a decade of civil war, and more Syrians are internally displaced within the country than are refugees abroad. Having that same problem with the pointer, sorry. But the Algerian refugees weren't going back to the country they'd left either. The point of getting them home in such a hurry after the ceasefire in March 1962, despite the risks of the operation and the continuing violence in Algeria, was so that they could participate in the July 1962 referendum that confirmed Algeria's independence as of September that year. In theory, the French colonial state remained sovereign as they returned. That's why the French imposed things like medical checks. In practice, though, a different national government in formation now claimed sovereign responsibility to care for them. The Algeria they'd left was legally part of the French mainland. The French Republic, the Algeria they came back to, was a wholly different country. This is similar to what had happened in post-dynastic Europe in the early 1920s when refugee repatriations were organized. It's commonly the case in other post-colonial displacements as well. So going home is usually not just going home, and we understand that better if we follow the experiences of the people being repatriated. Institutional archives often make this kind of thing look as if it's just a transfer of sovereignty from one institution to another. If you look at what that meant for the Beni Boussaid, for example, you see the process on the ground as a much more complex one. There are some other things to think about from this case when we try and understand refugee repatriations in a historical context. Mass repatriation like this, perhaps 200,000 people shifted in about 50 days, is a major logistical exercise. It fits into a history with other such humanitarian enterprises, humanitarian evacuations, which range across a similar time scale, from the evacuation of several tens of thousands of Armenians from Cilicia as the French army withdrew from it in late 1921, again part of the post-World War I territorial shakedown, to North Africa in 2011 and the evacuation of third country nationals from Libya as that country's war began. There's a logistical history to these exercises, which is really traces its roots to military logistics being adapted to humanitarian ends. But a thing that's important to remember is that that's also part of a history of population displacement resettlement, long-range relocation, expulsion becoming normalized, and that frequently there's a dark side to the history of massive logistical operations to displace large populations. For return to a point in a very recent article by Megan Bradley, Laura Matacora, and a couple of their colleagues about durable solutions and how what is meant by durable solutions has changed over time. This massive operation from the early 60s, a successful operation by pretty much every measure, as far as we know, not a single casualty, for example, despite the extreme tension within of the context and the danger of the minefields. It's difficult to imagine such an ambitious operation today when UNHCR seems to have an individualized understanding of what durable solutions for refugees might mean, as that quote in the opening slide showed. What we witness in 1962, in fact, is UNHCR, which at the start of its joint relief operation in Morocco and Tunisia was only a few years old, and by 1962 was still only a decade or so old. It was becoming the ambitious organization it would be in the 1960s and the 1970s. In the years around 1960, involved beyond Europe in a major humanitarian operation for the first time. Remember that UNHCR was set up as a small, mostly legal office to assist states with the implementation of the Refugee Convention. Now it finds itself involved in delivering humanitarian assistance, coordinating it, but here much more closely involved in delivering it, but still with humanitarian agencies as implementing partners on the ground. In the 1970s, over the course of that decade, UNHCR's annual budget went up from about $50 million to over $500 million. So it ballooned enormously because UNHCR became a direct provider of humanitarian aid, humanitarian actor, a major humanitarian actor in its own right, particularly as it was involved in a later Cold War context in managing the encampment and then resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees in the late 70s and 1980s. After 1990, all of these three durable solutions, but particularly resettlement to a third country and repatriation, come under pressure as rich world governments tighten their wallets, as global South governments narrow their horizons, and as the international refugee regime, obliged to respond to the choices made by states in the global North and in the global South, found itself being shifted away from durable solutions that would really be solutions to displacement, and towards the containment of refugees through indefinite encampments and a suspension rather than a solution of refugee crises. We'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malika and Ben. That was a really rich presentation and a really important topic, clearly directly relevant to World Refugee Day, which is today. That's great. So Malika and Ben have kindly agreed to take questions, but we only have a few minutes for Q&A. So please, everybody, keep your questions and your answers brief, if that's possible. Just a reminder that we've recorded the talk itself for the Madar website, but we'll now stop the recording, and we're not going to upload the question and answer session on the